Right here. Stop using the jetpack.
God, I've missed this game. Ba, ba, ba. Hey, what are we talking about? Something about a case study? Well, Team Fortress 2, by now, is a very old game. I've been playing this game since I was literally 8 years old, all the way back in 2007. Every TF2 player gets a badge in their inventory that tells them the date and time that they first played the game. My badge is from October the 21st, 2007, just 11 days after the game released. And the last time I played the game was yesterday, so you can tell that I really got some good mileage out of this game. I have a lot of hours in this game. Not only is the core gameplay of the game extremely fun, but the community-made game modes and maps are also extremely fun. I would say anywhere between a third to half of my hours in this game were spent in jump maps. Community-made maps that are specifically designed for you to rocket jump around in. They're like obstacle courses for rocket jumping. Regular viewers of the channel will already have figured out that I love platformer games, so Team Fortress 2's jump maps acting like a first-person platformer minigame in Team Fortress 2 was right up my alley. I was always that one guy that was playing engineer on the jump map and shooting myself up the arse with the Wrangler to beat the map, and I had a blast doing it every time. But that doesn't mean I didn't play the regular game of TF2 a whole lot as well. I've seen every single era that TF2 has had to offer, and it unironically has been a big part of my life. So it's going to be quite the honour to talk about it in depth in a video like this. Once upon a time, Team Fortress 2 received very regular balance patches, as well as semi-regular content updates that added new maps and new unlockable items. The only way we're likely to see major content updates return to the game is if Valve decides to hand development off to like a third-party company that could continue to work on the game. But since that's quite unlikely, let's reminisce on the good old days, eh? Valve made some very questionable decisions with this game back in the day. It literally took them years to patch out certain bugs. But they also made some very good decisions, so the game is very well designed despite any mistakes that they might have made along the way. But the game was released nearly 14 years ago. TF2 is going to have its 14th birthday in October of this year, and the game has been almost completely abandoned by the developers. And you can really feel the strain that Valve's lack of attention has brought to the game. I only recently reinstalled this game for the first time in about a year and a half, and within my first hour of playing, I'd already bumped into multiple aimbots that would use my username to cheat in-game. And then when you try and vote kick it, the vote doesn't go through because the bot has other bots on the server automatically voting no. And sometimes, someone accidentally tries to kick the real me instead of the bot, and I'm gone. This is all due to the fact that the team at Valve that still actively work on this game is very small, much smaller than it used to be, and the incentive to put the time and money into fixing these problems once and for all just isn't there. They've done a lot to fix the bot problem. It's a lot better now than it was a few months or a few years ago, but the problem is very much still here. It would be impossible to entirely remove the problem from the game, and it would take large amounts of Valve's resources to fix this problem any more than they already have. So for now, this is the TF2 we have to live with. But that's enough about the doom and gloom. I want to talk balance. I want to talk about game design, because this game is a masterpiece, despite all of its flaws. So where to begin? Well, there's literally no way that I talk about everything in this video, so we have to start somewhere. TF2 has 160 unlockable weapons, 208 if you include weapon reskins. It also has dozens of maps and game modes to choose from. Some of these are great, some of these are terrible. But let's start at the very, very core of the game. The classes. These 9 characters right here is what the game's foundation is built on top of. These 9 characters are cleverly designed with each other character in mind. Each class is designed to be strong or weak into the other classes in certain scenarios. The Spy has a sapper that can disable and destroy Engineer's buildings, so obviously the Spy is useful for countering Engineer. The Pyro can set spies on fire, even while they're disguised or invisible, making them great for checking for spies. Snipers are very good at killing the light classes that have 150 health or less, because a single uncharged headshot will instantly kill those classes. I mean, assuming you can hit your bloody shot! The classes are designed with strengths and weaknesses in mind. Even the generalist classes like Soldier and Demo Man have strengths and weaknesses. The Demo Man only has projectile weapons, meaning that it's hard for him to easily kill enemies up close to him without damaging himself. If a scout gets up in the Demo Man's face, the Demo Man has to land some very difficult shots with his pipe bomb launcher, and if he does land those shots, he's going to damage himself in the process anyway. The Soldier and the Demo Man are both very mobile classes, but they have to damage themselves in exchange for that mobility. They have to shoot rockets at their feet to rocket jump, and they have to shoot stickies at their feet to sticky jump. So even the generalists are kept in check by certain strengths and weaknesses that they possess. Every single one of the classes has its place in the game. They all have their strengths and weaknesses, and a successful team will likely need to use most, if not all, of the classes at some point to get the job done. Well, mostly. Because to anyone who's played TF2 for a long period of time, especially people who played it competitively, one of these classes stands out as a bit of an outlier compared to the rest. I'll give you a second to figure out which one it is. It's the Spy.
Merde.
The Spy is what you would call a pick class. It's his job to pick off high priority enemies. He's not a high DPS character like the Demo Man or the Soldier. He's for single target assassination. But there's a problem with this, because everything the Spy is good at is accomplished even more effectively by this guy.
G'day.
The Sniper. Everything Spy can do, Sniper does better. The Spy has to spend a long time sneaking around and getting behind the enemy lines. He then has to approach the target and backstab them. The majority of the time, the Spy will be killed immediately after he gets a kill, maybe two. The Sniper has to just find a long sight line and he can start clicking on some heads. The Spy has his sapper that he can use to disable buildings, but the Sniper can just headshot the Engineer and then shoot the buildings to destroy them. Or better yet, kill the Engineer from a safe distance and let his team destroy the buildings while the Engineer isn't around to stop them. But H2, the voices in my head scream at me never-endingly. The Sniper is only better than the Spy if the Sniper player is skilled enough to land all of his shots. Well, this is correct. In casual games, with uncoordinated teams and giant skill differences between players, the Sniper isn't necessarily better than the Spy. In uncoordinated games against people who installed the game about 15 minutes ago, the Spy doesn't have a hard time getting behind the enemy. Enemies are much more likely to fall for his disguises, and he's much more likely to be able to slip away unharmed after killing an enemy or two. But when a skilled player picks up Sniper, they can accomplish all of the things a Spy can accomplish, but from a safe distance, without nearly as much preparation required. In coordinated competitive matches, it's even worse. A group of 6 versus 6 players on comms to each other aren't going to be fooled by their 7th teammate strolling on past them, are they? Even if the Spy manages to get one kill, once they've realised the enemy team has a Spy, that Spy is going to find it impossible to get a single kill on the enemy team. Everything Spy can do, Sniper does better. The Spy's effectiveness is very heavily related to the enemy team's lack of skill, which is quite a unique phenomenon for most games. And the best Spy in the world will still repeatedly die to a Pyro who has 4.5 brain cells and turns around every once in a while. Whereas the Sniper relies mostly on his own skill to hit headshots, rather than the opponent's lack of skill. But don't get me wrong, I don't think that the Spy is poorly designed. Quite the opposite, in fact. I think the design of the Spy is very clever. His kit rewards him for being sneaky and deceptive, and he is fun to play because of it. But Valve didn't anticipate that, at higher levels of play, the Sniper and the Spy would have a lot of overlapping strengths, but the Sniper would inherit fewer of the weaknesses. Spy is weak to pyro flames, he's weak to coordinated teams, he's weak to players with functioning ears, to players with functioning brains, and he loses every 1v1 with any of the power classes. The only class that a spy can reliably beat in a 1v1 is the medic, and the medic is designed to be defenseless on his own. The sniper's only real weaknesses are spies and other snipers. But despite all that, for the vast majority of players, none of this matters. Because the vast majority of players are playing the game in casual or community servers, where nobody is coordinated, the skill level of each player varies wildly, and everyone's just running around doing their own thing. But for the top 1%, this issue has caused Spy to be almost completely non-existent in competitive 6 vs 6. But despite that, the Spy is a fan favourite class. Every edgy Redditor loves to play as Spy. But how can that be if he's made redundant by the sniper's existence? Well, it's simple. The Spy's kit is fun, has lots of depth, and is interesting to use. The Spy's class identity is very simple and very easy to understand. He sneaks around, and he stabs stuff in the back. But despite that simple game plan, the class has a ton of skill expression and depth to it. Learning trick stabs, like stair stabbing and corner stabbing, gives a good spy player a massive edge on other players, as well as a skill to learn to keep them playing the class. And that's something that all of the classes have, to at least some extent, that makes the game so much fun to learn and play. Each class is very simple to understand, but has a lot of depth for skilled players to use to their advantage. A new soldier can run around and shoot rockets, and he'll have fun and he'll get some kills for sure, but a skilled soldier can learn how to rocket jump, to give himself incredible mobility and positioning advantages. Good soldiers will shoot rockets at players' feet to make it easier to land shots and to bounce them around a bit, and will get good at air-shotting other airborne players. A new medic will just sit and heal the heavy and watch him play the game, waiting for the game to end. A skilled medic can keep his entire team topped up on health, and when the enemy soldier jumps in on him, he can use the blast damage of enemy rockets to rocket jump away to safety. Skilled players have a lot to play around with, because the design of each of the characters and the design of the game's engine itself allows for a lot of variety in the gameplay. Some classes have a lot more skill expression than others though. A brand new heavy will rev up his minigun and he'll point it in the general direction of the enemy team. And a skilled heavy will rev up his minigun and do the exact same thing. He'll just be more accurate with his shots. I guess the heavy can jump around corners when he revs up his gun so that he's slightly more mobile, but that's about it. A bad sniper and a skilled sniper are still just trying to click on opponents' heads, aren't they? But the skilled sniper is doing a better job at it and has better positioning. This isn't an inherently bad thing, mind you. There is still definitely skill expression to be found in the sniper and the heavy, but the skill expression doesn't create variation in their gameplay, whereas the skill expression in other classes does. Soldiers and demo men can practically fly when they get good at the game, but a heavy is still just pointing and clicking his minigun on people. But the heavy's skill comes from not only accuracy, but positioning. Heavy has the most health in the game, and he does the highest damage per second in the game too. But the heavy literally only has one weakness, and it's his lack of mobility. He's the slowest class in the entire game. You could also say that being fat is a weakness because he's a bigger target, but if he was as fast as a scout, his size wouldn't matter that much, he'd still be difficult to hit. The core weakness of the class is the lack of mobility, meaning that he is punished very hard for being out of position. A scout who's out of position has the chance to run away, but a heavy that's out of position is almost guaranteed to die. This means that a skilled heavy's positioning has to be much better than the inexperienced heavy's positioning. So the skilled heavy is going to live a lot longer and get a lot more kills than the bad heavy. But the skill difference isn't as obvious from an outside perspective, is it? And speaking of the heavy, let's discuss the elephant in the room that is the unlockable weapons. Like we mentioned before, there are 160 unlockable weapons. Each weapon has unique stats and effects. Some of the weapons are just designed to be different versions of the default version of the weapon, like the Iron Bomber or the Lock and Load. They're both pipe bomb launchers for the demo man. They shoot grenades just like the default launcher does. But the grenades behave differently, they deal differing amounts of damage and stuff like that. But some of the unlockable items create what we call a subclass. The Demo Man is characterised by higher damage projectile-based explosive weapons, as well as fairly good mobility. But there is a Demo Man subclass called the Demo Knight. These handful of unlockable weapons turn that high DPS projectile Demo Man into a melee bruiser pick class that wants to charge into battle and cut people's heads off with a sword. The Demo Knight is still technically a Demo Man, but he behaves so much differently than a regular Demo Man and has completely different strengths and weaknesses, so we call it a subclass. And most of the classes in the game have some sort of subclass. The Sniper has the Huntsman, the Engineer has the Gunslinger, the Pyro has the Dragon's Fury and also the stupid jetpack thing that lets him fly. The Soldier has the Rocket Jumper and the Market Gardener. All of these weapons completely change the playstyle of the classes they're equipped on, so much so that they become a subclass. But not every character has a subclass. Going back to our boy the Heavy, he's lacking a subclass. You could technically say that the Buffalo Steak Sandwich is a subclass, but this thing is terrible. You'd actually be better off just running around with your melee weapon out without using this item. Not only is it terrible, but it's also not quite as exciting as something like Demo Knight or the Huntsman, is it? The closest thing that the Heavy has to a subclass is the Fat Scout, where you just run around with a shotgun for a joke and try and kill people. But this isn't supported by any of the unlockable weapons in the same way as these other subclasses are. This isn't a bad thing in and of itself. Other classes like Scout and Medic don't really have a subclass either, but they're always good additions to the game, especially for a class like Heavy that a lot of people in the community considers to be very boring to play. The unlockable weapons in Team Fortress 2 are what caused the bulk of the balance issues in the game. Back in the very early days of 2007 Team Fortress 2, the balance issues were caused by the inherent design of the class itself. Pyro's afterburn damage did 60 damage, even if he only touched you for a single frame with his flamethrower. The Demo's pipes didn't damage himself with the splash damage when he direct hit an enemy. The Engineer couldn't pick up his buildings, meaning that he couldn't save them in a pinch and he couldn't reposition them when he needed to, making the class weaker than he probably should be. There was a lot of stuff like that, but all of these issues got ironed out fairly quickly. But the addition of new weapons for the classes was what caused the vast majority of the balance issues. The Lock and Load was a ridiculous weapon that could one-shot any of the light classes and could two-shot engineer buildings. Its downsides were half the clip size and the pipes disintegrating on impact with the surface. These downsides were not nearly enough to offset the insane strengths that the item had. I talked about the Lock and Load in depth in my first ever video. The video's terrible. Don't watch it. There's a link to it in the sidebar. The Equalizer used to give the soldier's melee attack more damage when he was on lower health, and he would also move faster while on lower health. This item was eventually nerfed by being split into two items, one that gave the damage bonus, and one that gave the move speed. The Demo Man's charge shields for Demo Knight used to let you turn faster the higher your frame rate was. Players on lower frame rate systems would turn left and right slower during their charge than people on higher frame rate systems. This was eventually fixed, and a new shield called the Tide Turner was added to let the Demo Knight players turn really crazy fast like they used to be able to on high frame rate systems. The Criticola is a consumable item that gives the Scout mini crits for 8 seconds, making him deal 35% bonus damage. The downside is that the Scout will also take that 35% increased damage after attacking for a little while. The old Criticola's downside was just 2 seconds of increased damage penalty after the effect wore off. It also used to give the Scout, the fastest class in the game, a 25% movement speed bonus. This item in casual games isn't much of an issue, but in competitive games it allows Scouts that get in on the flank to get picks much easier than usual. There's many more examples of this, way more than we've got time for, and some are more egregious than others. But this is where most of the balance issues, both past and present, have come from. Some weapons are extremely powerful in most, if not all, situations, and some weapons are almost completely useless, their only use being to style on people by killing them while being as stupid as humanly possible. And since Valve has almost entirely abandoned development on the game, only fixing major issues and repurposing the same Halloween and Christmas updates for the past 5 years, none of this is likely to get changed anytime soon. Some of the unlockable weapons are a stroke of genius, being fun to use and fun to play against, as well as giving players a whole new way to play. Some of the unlockable weapons, especially the ones released later into the game's life cycle, were a little bit less exciting. Like, who actually uses any of these weapons? Nobody that knows better, because they're terrible when compared to every alternative that you have at your disposal, and they're not even that exciting either. Another problem that some of the unlockable weapons had was that they covered up class weaknesses in a way that made the class overbearing when using that item. The most obscene example, in my opinion, was the gloves of running urgently on the heavy. The heavy's literal only major weakness is his slow movement speed. Not only does that make it much more important for him to position correctly, but it also made it hard for him to get to the front lines quickly in a game like 5CP or King of the Hill. The gloves of running urgently completely removed the issue of getting to mid on time, and it could make it a lot easier for him to run away from positions that he shouldn't have been in. Another example of a similar issue is the Spicicle. The Spicicle isn't nearly as bad as the gloves were, but it's a similar thing. The biggest counter to spies is pyros. The Spicicle allows the spy to not be lit on fire for a duration in exchange for destroying their weapon for 15 seconds. Creating weapons that just straight up remove weaknesses of a class is never a good design philosophy, and TF2 had a number of examples of this. Something directly covering up a weakness doesn't necessarily make it instantly overpowered by default though. The Razorback prevented snipers from being backstabbed by spies, but that item was never overpowered. Wanna know why? Well, this is why. But designing items like this is always risky, because if you aren't careful, the item will be overpowered. There are also some unlockable weapons that aren't necessarily overpowered, but they're just objectively better than all of the other options that the class has to choose from. The Medic has two of these, the Crusader's Crossbow and the Ubersaw. The Ubersaw is objectively better than every other bone saw. It allows him to sneakily get an uber advantage on the enemy medic whenever he escapes in a pinch. The regular bone saw having a slightly faster attack speed is completely irrelevant because the medic doesn't want to be constantly swinging at enemies anyway. They want to swing once and run away, or just not swing their weapon at all. The Crusader's Crossbow is a single shot weapon that deals damage to enemies and heals teammates. The medic doesn't want to be running around with his primary weapon, he wants to be healing teammates, so a rapid fire weapon like the needle gun isn't really the best option. A single shot weapon that allows you to switch to it, get a quick shot off, and then immediately switch back to the medigun is a much better choice. Not to mention that it allows you to burst heal allies from range, which none of the other primary weapons allow. These two items are objectively better than all of the other options available, but they're not exactly oppressive or overpowered, they're just very good weapons. Nobody gets hit by an Ubersaw or a crossbow and thinks, wow, that weapon's overpowered, do they? But despite the community being completely okay with the item's existence, the items are still overbearing, considering that every other alternative to them is just worse than they are. But all of that being said, for the most part, the stock weapons are the best weapons in the game, which is a very good thing for the game. A heavy reliance on certain unlocks can cause new players a lot of issues, feeling like they aren't able to compete with everyone else because they don't have the shiny new items that they need. But luckily for those new players, most of the stock weapons are the best and most versatile options available. Maybe the stock melee weapons for stuff like Scout, Demoman and Soldier are outclassed by a lot of other weapons, but the stock scattergun, rocket launcher and pipe launcher are the best and most versatile weapons on offer for those classes. There is so much to talk about with this game. There's so many interesting things to talk about, and there's probably a ton of stuff that I just straight up forgot about. In fact, I didn't talk about Man vs. Machine a single time. But this video will be longer than the 13.5-year lifespan that Team Fortress 2 has lived if I don't end it somewhere. So I guess I'll just end it here. This video was all over the place, but I hope you enjoyed my little rant, and be sure to remind me of everything that I should have mentioned but didn't down in the comments. Thanks for watching.